So I want to say a few sentences about what we're going to try to do, and it is admittedly somewhat ambitious. I want to explore together the idea that, at least in significant part, what prayer is about is an attempt to overcome egocentrism and self-assertion. We'll try to kind of define those terms as we go. And we're going to do that, I think, in two parts. One, by first thinking in some depth about Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel's approach to prayer, and then bring him into conversation with Rabbi Soloveitchik and Isha, who I think offer very different pictures of what it means to allow prayer to help us overcome the ego. Along the way, if we have time, I want to say a few sentences about whether Heschel is or is not a mystic and why we might or might not care about that discussion, which I think is actually just an interesting thing to play with and think about. Okay? So my original plan was to do kind of an integration of frontal teaching, conversation, and chavruta. I'm not totally sure that chavruta is going to be a plausible model given the current arrangements of the furniture, but we will see. You'll tell me whether, oh no, I guess I'm not allowed to talk to you during the video, right? Okay. So, all right, so I'm going to pass around some sources. Okay, so just a little bit of a beginning. When you all have a copy of the sheet, you will see a line from God in Search of Man, Abraham Joshua Heschel's most important book, which is also, for the few of you who have read my book, a kind of major piece of what I try to do there. I argue that this sentence is a very important key to understanding Heschel's larger project as a writer, as a spiritual teacher, as a philosopher. The greatest beauty grows at the greatest distance from the center of the ego. The greatest beauty grows at the greatest distance from the center of the ego. Okay? As we'll see, I think this is actually an important interpretive key for understanding Heschel. Because the fundamental challenge and aspiration of having a spiritual life, as he sees it, is moving from ego-centeredness to other-centeredness. Or to put that slightly differently, to cultivate a posture of responsiveness, of feeling the call of God and other people, and being willing, able, even eager to respond to their needs, instead of surrendering to the ever-present temptation of relentlessly asserting ourselves. I want this, I need that, I demand this, I'm entitled to that. It's about responsiveness as opposed to use a word he uses, I think not at all, but I think it captures him well, entitlement. Responsiveness as opposed to entitlement. So Heschel is, in many ways, in modern Jewish thought, the great theologian of self-transcendence. But what exactly is self-transcendence? That's what I want to sort of spend the first part thinking about together. Okay? And the way to do that is to think about a contrast in Heschel that I think is really fundamental and that requires kind of some unpacking because the words don't, at least one of these terms does not mean, I think, what it originally sounds like. The distinction in Heschel, the dichotomy that is probably most central to this is a distinction between what he calls reflexive concern on the one hand and transitive concern on the other. Reflexive concern means what it sounds like. I'm thinking about me. I'm thinking about what I need to survive and thrive. Transitive concern, which is a slightly idiosyncratic term, think of the term transitive verb. Transitive concern means I'm thinking about what you need to survive and thrive. And he thinks that if you have to kind of water down, sum up the spiritual life in just a couple of sentences, maybe even in one sentence, you would say, coming to understand that having only reflexive concern, you'll end up being a monster. And so the project is, how do you cultivate authentic transitive concern? Just to say that clearly, there is nothing wrong with having reflexive concern. You can't be organic life without reflexive concern, right? If you don't think about what will I eat, how will I protect myself from the cold, where will I sleep, you will die, right? The problem is when you live in a world, thanks Andrew, when you live in a world of only reflexive concern, then what happens? Those of you who are interested in modern Jewish thought, this is exactly parallel to what Martin Buber says about I, thou, and I, it. Right? There is nothing wrong with I-it relationships. That is like obviously a total misunderstanding of what Buber is saying. I-it relationships are what makes the world go round. The problem is what happens to a person, and even more dramatically to a culture, where all there is are I-it relationships. Right? So Heschel is not saying you can't have reflexive concern. This is not about like martyrdom as a spiritual ideal, but he is saying if all you have is reflexive concern, you're not really yet human. Going out of order, look at source 3 for a minute. Okay? A man entirely unconcerned with his self is dead. A man exclusively concerned with his self is a beast. Human is he who is concerned with other selves. We will not spend our time today talking about how some of this language that was very common and still common in certain quarters, contrasting humans with beasts, is outdated on many levels. First of all, we now know that a not insignificant number of beasts actually have transitive concern. And, you know, there's something very ironic. I don't know if you ever think about this, but this whole phenomenon in 20th century intellectual culture of accusing human beings who do unspeakable things of being animals, right? Animals have never dreamt up most of the cruelty that human beings have come up with, right? Animals don't build gas chambers. There's something just very kind of weirdly outdated about some of that way of talking, but the point, nevertheless, is clear, okay? So self-transcendence, the notion of not having myself be the center of the universe, not convincing myself that myself is the center of the universe, is predicated on, it may even be simply defined as reflexive concern, genuine care for others. This notion of transitive concern, Heschel thinks goes hand in hand with, may actually be synonymous with, a transformation from being focused on myself to being focused on God. Now, I just want to anticipate an anxiety that I'm sure some people in the room are going to have about this, and if it makes sense, we can talk about it later. Yes, I do think Heschel thinks it is possible to have transitive concern and not have it be focused on God, at least explicitly. But I want to try to bracket that at least for now. Right? Is it possible to have a fully self-transcendent secular person in Heschel's universe? I think it's actually not an easy question, and if that grabs you and people want to talk about that, in a few minutes we'll stop and try to talk about that. Okay? So I suggest that basically there's a series of terms that you can more or less equate with each other. Okay? 1 is self-transcendence, 2 is reflexive concern, and 3 is God-centeredness, or making space for God. Okay? Now, I'm going to take like a few more steps, and then I'll stop and take a round of comments, and then we're going to start reading Heschel more closely inside. So according to Heschel, there are 2 fundamental ways of living in the world. 2 fundamental ways of being. What he calls the way of wonder and the way of expediency. Can anyone define expediency? This confirms my theory. Some of you heard me say this many times, but expediency for me was one of those words. You know, there are words that you have read 1,000 times, you've probably even used, and then one day you realize you have actually had no idea what they mean. I think expediency is a great example of that word for many people. It was only when I started writing about Heschel that I realized I have no idea what that word actually means. Do you want, yeah?
Something like quick, something that you use for another purpose, something that uses a means.
Yeah, and for Heschel especially, something that you use as a means to serve your own selfish ends. That which is expedient is that which serves me. Okay? The question that I ask about the world in the way of expediency is, how can I use this? Okay? How can I use this? So in the way of expediency, when I live my life animated by expediency, he says, we accumulate information in order to dominate, right? My goal is to control things, to make them do what I want them to do. In the way of wonder, we deepen our appreciation in order to respond. Right? Information versus appreciation. Why is that important? Because one of Heschel's most famous sentences, underneath all of Heschel's great quotes is actually a philosophy that no one actually bothers to try to understand. When he says, mankind will perish not for want of information, but for want of appreciation. Right? Mankind will perish not for want of information, but for want of appreciation. This is in part what he's talking about. We know more and more, and we convince ourselves in modernity that it's all there to serve us. That's the fundamental kind of spiritual critique of the modern world. How many people have ever taken a class in which there was some discussion of Martin Heidegger? So some of you who have read Heidegger on Technology will recognize some of these themes. I think Heschel was one of the many Jewish thinkers who was very influenced by Heidegger and very anxious about admitting that because he was an important philosopher and a horrible person. But Heidegger, right, famously says, what is the ill of modernity? Basically, the only thing we're interested in is everything is a resource for my own benefit. Right? He famously says, right, if we were honest with ourselves in Germany, we would admit that the Rhine is merely a resource for the tourism industry, but it has no intrinsic value at all. And Heschel is deeply influenced by that. Only, okay, a momentary digression. For Heschel, this is really about ethics. For Heidegger, it's about this kind of weird mystical connection to being. If you don't know what that means, you're in pretty good company. Okay? So the argument essentially is this. Life is a struggle between the desire to assert myself over and over and over again and the desire or the impulse to say, no, I'm not the center of the universe, and you matter as well. Now, I think it's important to just say, and then I want to take some questions, it's easy to see this as, oh, so Heschel's saying that one option is to be a monster, and the other option is to be a human being, right? And I think it's important to say that for most of us, this struggle is much more constant and subtle, right? Think about a moment in your life when you can honestly say, if none of you recognize this, I will feel that A, I'm a terrible person, or B, you're not being honest, okay? A moment when you actually can say that you really responded to someone in need in a way that was focused on them, and then marveled 2 minutes later that you could be so selfish in another context, right? It's very, very important to Heschel to say self-transcendence is not a state we achieve. Self-transcendence is something that we achieve in moments, and then the next encounter happens. If I could speak yeshivish for a minute, or Hasidish yeshivish for a minute, in a way that Heschel doesn't speak, right? I think Heschel thinks it's extremely significant that Chazal, our sages, never speak about bitul hayetzer, only about kibush hayetzer. That is, they never talk about simply overcoming the Yetzer Hara so that it no longer bothers me anymore. It's kibush hayetzer. I subjugate it for this moment. And then what happens in the next moment? We're at it again. Now, on one level, that is very non-poetic, right? And another level, it is deeply realistic. And Heschel thinks about self-transcendence in a very similar way. It is not about, only about being a monster. It is also simply about how you talk to other people. My self-righteous example of this was I got furious last year when someone came up to me at a conference and said, I want to introduce you to this friend of mine. I think he could be really useful to you. And it took me everything I had not to start yelling at him, right? Now, by the way, what he meant was he could be really useful for advancing certain things, trying to accomplish, whatever. It was not actually so cynical, but the language was horrific, right? You should really meet this person. He could be useful to you. That is the language of self-assertion. That is the language of what Heschel's trying to overcome. What he thinks the spiritual life is about overcoming. Okay. Let me stop and I just said a bunch of stuff. So thoughts, questions, observations, rejoinders, confusions, whatever. Yeah, I mean, the question in philosophy and psychology about whether there is such a thing as altruism, right, goes back very far and has not made, as far as I'm aware, a whole lot of progress, right? We rehearse that struggle over and over again. So I could imagine Heschel answering in one of two ways, one of which is more idealistic, and one of which I think is more sort of oriented by Musser in a certain way. The idealistic way is to say, you know what? I just don't believe that people can't do it because I've seen it with my own eyes. Now, of course, that is not a philosophical argument, right? Because what you can say to that is, well, you think you saw it with your own eyes, but what was really going on, right? We do, after all, live in an age where, like, we could call our era post-Freud. No one should ever assume, right, that what they think about their own motives, let alone about other motives, other people's motives, is, oh yeah, that's the whole story, right? But I think Heschel, this part of him that reveres a certain mode of piety, I think would be willing to say, yeah, I've seen it. It may be rare, but I've seen it. Find that compelling or not. I think the more interesting thing he might say, although he certainly never admits this, so it may be that I'm projecting on him, but I suspect he would say something like this. Look, you always set up ideal types when you're trying to change people. And even if people don't ever fully embody an ideal, it allows them to choose a course. What's an example of this? How many people have ever read Psalm 1? Tehillim Perek Aleph. So have you ever thought about Tehillim Perek Aleph as bizarre, right? There is Derech Risha'im, there's like the path of the wicked, and there's Derech Tzadikim, the way of the righteous. What about the people in this room? No, right, I'm like, seriously, right? Like, I mean, no offense, Hadar, I don't mean you, but right, right. What about everybody else between the wicked and the righteous, right? What about Derech Beinonim? That's the path I'm going to walk down, right? But I think what Psalm 1 is actually doing is saying, okay, fine, but the point is, I'm going to lay out these very strong types because my point is, choose your direction. What do you aspire to? What do you want to become as close as you possibly can to being? And in those situations, sort of muddy the waters with, oh yeah, it's not milchik, it's not fleshik, it's parv, right? It's not helpful. Because the point is you want people to, the whole point is asking people to reach towards something. So I think what Heschel would say is it possible that self-transcendence fully doesn't happen? Maybe it's possible, but even if it's possible, the fact is you can still get closer and farther, and there is a power to that rhetoric. There's a power to the rhetoric of laying out the options, right? And in certain ways, actually that raises fascinating questions about when you read modern Jewish thought in general, but Heschel in particular. Is this primarily a book of philosophy, theology, spiritual guidance, a sermon about modernity, which he thinks is about to obliterate the world? No, right? It's actually because someone will talk in a slightly different idiom depending on what he's doing, right? One of the things that I've suggested is some of the people who most dismiss Heschel for his rhetorical excesses may not realize that he's not telling you what he would tell you over coffee at Starbucks. He's telling you what he's trying to tell you because he thinks the world is in crisis and he wants to grab you and shake you really hard. Right? And think about what you would do in those two situations. If someone said to you, do you really believe what you just said? You know, mishkavcha baleilot, as you go to sleep at night, do you really think that that's true? You might say, well, obviously it's more complicated than that, but my point is, I really want people to take this seriously, right? How can you talk about man as a beast the way Heschel does and still affirm human beings being created in the image of God? And isn't that a dangerous way to talk? So I think that he would be very careful to say, and it goes directly to the last problem we dealt with. It's a context in which I'm not talking about any individual. I'm talking about what could happen if, right? I'm pretty confident that Heschel would have refused very strongly to ever say, let me take this back. You know, Leo Strauss used to say, one of Leo Strauss's great lines, is that whenever Leo Strauss, great philosopher, University of Chicago, used to say, whenever you're losing an argument, you should invoke the argumentum ad Hitlerum, which means you say, oh yeah, and what about Hitler? And then no matter what the topic on the table is, you win, because like it's such an extreme case that no one knows what to say. So I stopped because I could imagine Heschel saying, yes, there were people in the world who I would happily describe as beasts. But right? Let's not get lost in that. Let's actually talk about this, which is the reality of most people who are not that. And what I'm trying to say to them is, don't you see how dangerous this could be? Don't you see what happens when you get so used to asserting your ego, where the only question of modernity is, how can I use this? If that sounds abstract, right, think about it like this. Think about how religion is sold to people in America now. It too becomes about serving our own needs, right? This is actually something that Yeshayahu Leibovitz, for all his manifold philosophical limits, right, say that up front, actually was desperately trying to struggle with. right? Like, how do I actually do something that's not about me? You could like the way he does it or not, but that's what drives him crazy. And, I mean, just think about, I mean, I hope this doesn't offend anyone, but this drives me crazy kind of living in this area of the world. How do we market yoga classes? Give yourself a gift. Not discipline yourself with a 3,000-year-old spiritual path that teaches you love and connection. No, give yourself a gift, right? There's something about the commercialization, commodification of spiritual life, right, that runs very, very deep. How can religion serve you? Or some American rabbis talk about what we need to do is convince Jews to hire Judaism to do something for them. In those words, Bahai Lishna, to hire Judaism, right? The irony is that in using that language, they become like the very people they're trying to transform, right? Everything becomes a commodity. It's for me, hiring it, right? That's what Heschel's really worried about. And of course, it's not about, you know, I'm going to point to people and say they're beasts, but I am going to hold out that possibility. By the way, I suspect that the Rambam in Hilchot Teshuvah is doing the same thing when he goes on this whole thing about Paro, right? There are some people who behave so badly that, in the Rambam's language, God takes away their freedom, which is really the Rambam's way of saying they lose their freedom, right? The point of that story is not to say, oh, look how many people lose their freedom. The point is, I'm writing about Teshuvah, I'm trying to get you to change. Can you think about what could happen if you don't take responsibility for yourself? You could be Paro. How many people are going to be Paro? Very few. But you give extreme cases as part of an attempt to jolt people. Does that make more sense? You're not totally persuaded, but okay. Okay, one more, and then we're going to plow. Does Heschel think we have an obligation to pursue self-transcendence? I think he thinks that, I would even say this is pre-Jewish. In order to be fully human, we have an obligation to pursue self-transcendence. And if you want to say it differently, the only way we have any hope of genuinely responding to someone else's needs because they are someone else's needs, or responding to Hashem's will because it's Hashem's will, right, is if we are capable of moments, at least, of self-transcendence. Otherwise, I respond to people only because I want people to notice how great I am, or I respond to God because I want rewards, right? In other words, I think he thinks it's actually logically entailed that if you want to be genuinely responsive as opposed to merely manipulative, and the line can be very fine, right? You have to at least strive towards a certain kind of self-transcendence. Okay, look at source one for a minute, okay? This is just basically what we've been talking about in his language. There is a perpetual tension in man between the focus of the self and the goal that lies beyond the self. Here again, animal in man is driven to concentrate on the satisfaction of needs. Spiritual man is the will to serve higher ends. And in serving ends, he transcends his needs. That's a phrase we could talk about, but we won't yet. Source 2, Heschel says, right, in life, we are attached to two centers, right, to the focus of ourself and to the focus of God. Driven by two forces, we have both the impulse to acquire, to enjoy, to possess, and the urge to respond, to yield, to give. Acquisitiveness, Heschel thinks, is the very opposite of a spiritual life. And those of you who have been studying with me at Hadar know whether or not Heschel was fully conscious of this, that's also the fundamental vision of Sefer Dvarim. Thinking that you own things in some ultimate way is the most dangerous thing in the world. Because it's the ultimate way of learning to say, I, as opposed to how can I share? It's a gift, how can I share? One of the things I think is interesting, for whatever it's worth, is to think about how Heschel would have, whether Heschel would have and how he would have, had he lived longer, begun to talk about the economic implications of a lot of his ideas. Right? Because I don't want to be misheard here, but the complicated underside of a capitalist economy, and especially a consumerist economy, is the very fact that the engine is about convincing ourselves that I want. It's something actually that militates against a certain kind of self-transcendence, right? Other forms of economics have their own problems that Judaism can critique. But if you think about, and I've said this many times, right, I think rather than playing the unhelpful game of thinking, is Judaism in favor of socialism or capitalism, which the answer is no, right? I think we might say, right, that what Judaism does well, ideally, is whatever economic context it finds itself in, it offers a countercultural critique of its excesses, right? So in a socialist context, it reminds us about the importance of individuality. In a capitalist context, it warns about acquisitiveness, about selfishness, about lack of empathy, whatever, okay? So here we have this nervousness about acquisitiveness. Now here's the crucial point. And with this, we're going to shift to talking about prayer, actually, okay? For Heschel, it is like a basic premise of the whole project of Judaism, and for that matter, life, that human beings, that means you and I, really do have the capacity for moments of self-transcendence. We can respond to other people and to God authentically. I have often suggested that this is one of the great and fascinating divides between Jewish theology and especially Protestant theology, right? If you stopped a good Lutheran thinker and you said, what is the nature of human tragedy? Any good Lutheran thinker would say, you know, the problem is that God has expectations of us, and by the way we've been created, we're simply incapable of responding to them. Which is why we need to be saved by grace, because there's nothing we can actually do. And the more robustly orthodox, small o, you are as a Lutheran, the more you think it is heresy to imagine that human beings can respond to God's will without God, in fact, doing it for them. If you think of what is the Jewish notion of tragedy in most Jewish texts, it is actually that human beings do have the capacity to respond to God's will and almost never do. It's actually a very different texture of what it means to think of human tragedy, right? That's a slightly essentialized formulation, but I think it's basically accurate, right? Heschel's whole if you think about Heschel's project as a thinker who thinks modernity has gone to hell, right? He's writing these books in the 1950s, right? Modernity has gone to hell, right? It's essentially, wait a second, we have the capacity to respond to God, and look at us. That is the Jewish conception of human tragedy, right? It is the failure to actually do what we're capable of. And then if this kind of thing interests you, you can debate, at 3 in the morning about which of those is more tragic, right? Neither one of them makes you want to want to finish that sentence for me? Neither one of them wants to, neither one of them is exactly cheery, but there are very different ways of thinking about what it all means. Okay, now what does all this have to do with prayer? Okay, and this is where we begin to focus on thinking about tefillah and what it means for Heschel as a spiritual practice. Heschel argues in Man's Quest for God, a collection of his essays and speeches on prayer, that prayer is a crucial weapon, and arguably the crucial weapon, in our struggle with our own unbending selfishness. Now, that is partially a prescriptive claim, not a descriptive claim, meaning he is aware, any good religious thinker anywhere is aware and often in pain about the gap between his or her vision of what religion is and the reality of what religion is in front of him, right? Because we all know that religion can be a tool to amp up our own selfishness. God loves me and hates everybody else. Right? Or the reason I really believe is so God, kind of is like this cosmic candy dispenser. Right? It's possible to have religion that is not about overcoming selfishness, but Heschel is articulating kind of a normative vision of what it could be. Prayer is about struggling with selfishness. So the project of prayer is about molding a different kind of self. Right? To use language that he would not use, I'm going to use this language and then take it back, but I still think it's helpful for some people. Right? Prayer is a form of self-cultivation, right? A form of fashioning ourselves into the kinds of beings who are able to respond to other people and to respond to God's will. If you prefer, he would also say it this way: prayer is the process of allowing our true selves that are buried deep down inside of us to emerge and having all the false selves fall away. Right? That is about how most religious thinkers, many religious thinkers believe that on some level there is some part of us at least that is always already deeply connected to God. And what the spiritual life is about is peeling away the layers that keep me busy with other stuff. Christian thinkers in the modern, earlier too, but Christian thinkers in the 20th century talk a lot about the process of dropping your false self and having your true self reemerge. And the true self is connected to God as opposed to money, power, prestige, the ego, whatever. In Rabbi Soloveitchik's case, in one of his essays, it comes out in this very powerful way where he says that part of the reason we use, actually those of you in my class on Wednesday, we'll talk about this and we'll sit around a table and talk about it, is the project of trying to let go of all the false needs that modernity has convinced me that I have and getting in touch with the real needs that I have by dint of simply being human. And he has this amazing tirade about the advertising industry. He basically says, yeah, that's all about convincing me that I need things that I don't need. That's actually what it is. So for Heschel, you can either say it's about discovering a new self, or you can say it's about letting your real self emerge. The only hesitation I have about the phrase self-cultivation, I'm just going to sort of throw this out there, is that still sounds like it's very self-preoccupied. Right? Evelyn Underhill, a great 20th century Christian mystic, has this great sentence where she says something like, I'm going to get this a little wrong, but if you want to overcome your ego, for God's sake, don't take your devotional pulse all day. Right? Like, you know what that means? Right? It's like, you spend the hour after Shemona Esrei contemplating how your Shemona Esrei was. Right? It's really, right? And then all of a sudden, lo and behold, right, it's just like this engine for your own narcissism. That's the danger of self-cultivation as a language. But nevertheless, I think Heschel's saying something very important. Is there some room in Heschel, or even a gesture in Heschel, towards the balance that says I'm allowed to take care of myself and not simply deplete myself in the process of responding to others? Can I answer you in a sort of flip way that I think Heschel would say? I long for the world in which this is a genuine problem for more than a few people. Meaning, I actually think that would be his answer. Meaning, I think his answer would be, look, again, if you want to have a conversation about what happens to someone who is so committed to giving that they lose themselves, we can have that conversation. But I think Heschel thinks, you know what, in the context of where I'm writing and what I'm talking about, halavai, would that it were that this were the great spiritual crisis of our time. People are too empathic. Right? So, now, I'm not saying that to dismiss that concern. I'm saying it to understand sort of what is the concern here. I mean, think about, God in Search of Man, we're talking about 7 to 10 years after the entire universe out of which Heschel comes has been brutally murdered, right? It is the moment when the sense that modernity is monstrous. And does Heschel overdo that in certain ways? Yeah, probably he does, right? And was he conscious he was doing that? That's a really interesting question. I'm not sure. I think he felt it was so important to articulate a religiously grounded critique of the excesses of how we lived that it was worth it. It's very different than reading, let's say, Adam 1 and the Only Man of Faith, who asserts himself a lot. Right? Now, Soloveitchik tries to overcome that eventually, or at least make it more complicated with Adam 2. But you don't have Adam 1 in the early Heschel. You don't have this yes, it's religious heroism to assert yourself. Because his sense of the crisis is very different. And so he wants to focus very passionately somewhere else. But I suspect he would say, if you were asking him one-on-one, look, I've said reflexive concern is an obligation. You can't function, you'll die without reflexive concern. If you don't have some sense of your own well-being, you can't give. Right? Let me say it one other way. You need a self to self-transcend. This is why Heschel is not a Kabbalist. Talk about it later, right? You need to have a self to self-transcend. Does that make sense to me, what I mean by that? You can't be self-transcendent if there's no self to transcend. I'm not saying that every thinker in the history of the world who's used the phrase self-transcendence would say what I just said. But for Heschel, you need to have some sense of yourself. This, by the way, is a fascinating, those of you interested in feminist theory. So Reinhold Niebuhr and Paul Tillich, two of the most influential Christian theologians of the 20th century, both talk about how sin is having too much self. right? And fascinatingly, a variety of feminist theologians, one of the earliest ones, had the greatest name ever for a Christian theologian. Her name was Valerie Saving. Valerie Saving wrote this essay in which she basically said, I have rarely encountered a more androcentric conception of sin in my life. You're telling me, right, in 1950s America, that the problem of women's sinfulness is they have too much self? Halavai. Right? I would say the sin of men, this is, by the way, it's talking about essentialized gender discourse here, but nevertheless, it's important for its rhetorical power. No, you can't tell women they have too much self until they have a self in the first place. I don't think Heschel would actually disagree with that. I think he thinks, again, I'm in a context where the problem is too much self. But if we blessedly have the problem where many, many people have become too selfless, let's deal with that. And I suspect, as I'm saying, reflexive concern will be the way that he begins to deal with that. I don't know if you have to through the self to get there. Heschel, I think, would not like some of the sort of liberal religious talk about, I discover God inside myself. I think that's possible, but it also has the potential to be insufferable, right? So I think it's not about going necessarily inside the self to find God there. Interestingly, you never find the phrase that is all over later Kabbalah, and especially Chassidut, the notion that the soul is chelek Eloah mimal, the notion that the soul is a piece of God, right? You don't have anything like that in Heschel. But what you do have is a sense, maybe I could say it this way, this is actually what I want to talk about much later, but say it now. Heschel is so deeply committed to biblical thinking that you could think about it like this. The relationship that the Torah and the prophets envision is always about two parties, God and human beings. It's covenantal. You can't have covenant unless I'm not God and God is not me. And you can't have covenant unless I'm a real person with a self. Who's God talking to if there's no one there? Right? So there has to be a self that can respond to God, right? So it's not, maybe you could say, I think there's a certain slipperiness in Heschel with the way he uses the word ego, right? Sometimes, ego is a basic necessary human function, and then ego is also a dirty word. We use that the same way too, probably a lot in kind of the way we speak. But so I think what he's trying to say is, I try to become the kind of person who gives everything I have to respond to God's call on me. And in order to do that, I can't ever allow myself not to be a self. Does that make sense? Is that clearer? It's one of the reasons why how many people here have ever really studied Chassidut in a serious way? I know I sort of stacked the deck the way I asked that, right? So one of the things you find a lot in Chassidut is at least the discourse of dveikut, meaning the disillusion of the self. This is not Gershom Shalom's notion of dveikut. This is actually the dveikut, as it's pretty clear that people like the circle of the Maggid of Mezrich are all talking about. Those are the people who basically founded Chassidut, right? So there's this notion that in spiritual life, there's moments at least where my self totally dissolves, right? Now, just want to say, there are some of you who will hear that phrase and say, oh yeah, I totally get that. And others who are like, what on earth could that even mean? I just want to acknowledge that. But what's interesting is you never have that in Heschel at all. And the reason for that is that ultimately, everything else he believes, I think, is filtered through a fundamental commitment to Tanakh and its categories. And Tanakh would never talk that way. Right? Tanakh would never talk that way. The whole spiritual life, maybe you could say it like this. How's this for a totally overly simplistic and yet I think not totally inaccurate formulation? For parts of Kabbalah and Chassidut, the fundamental insight of the world is that at least at moments everything is God. Notice that I caveated that more than many neo-Hasidic thinkers caveat that. Right? At moments, at least, you have some insight, some window, some perception that everything is God. In the Bible, right, fundamental theological perception, nothing is God but God. That's called Breshit Aleph. God made the world is God's, but the world is not God. That's at least the theology of Breshit Aleph, right? Why am I saying all this? Because there's otherness. That's the point. There's otherness. Heschel would have very little patience, I think, with to use the sort of trendy language of contemporary spirituality, non-duality. Doesn't speak to him at all, because covenant is dual. It's about you and me. Buber. It's about, right? There's a space between us, and there's a space between me and God as well. Why is self-transcendence such a preoccupation for Heschel? So here's what I think underlies this. And I think in certain ways, taking apart your question is an amazing window into what's so important to him. I think if you asked Heschel, is this primarily about ethics or is this about theology? I think he would say, I believe that Jewish sources do not understand that dichotomy. In other words, that it does not mean that I can reduce God to the ethical, but it means, according to Heschel, which is obviously a choice of how to read the Masorah, right, of how to read the tradition, but I believe, Heschel says, that we worship a God, this is basically one of the central thrusts of his book, The Prophets, that we worship a God, I come to God, as it were, and I say, I want to love you. And God says, great, love who I love. I love widows and orphans. And there ain't no way out of that web. And you say, but I want to have a great davening experience. And God says, great, but unless you also love widows and orphans, this is basically nothing but a kick of yours, right? So it's precisely the refusal of that question. By the way, this is an enormous chasm between Heschel and the later Rabbi Soloveitchik, right? The notion that what Judaism is about in some deep way is that we're all required to have an Akedah, where we sacrifice our ethical impulse to God. I think Heschel would correctly point out, A, that's a terrible reading of the Akedah, and B, that's a horrible theology. Because I'm not endorsing Heschel's position, I'm trying to understand it, right? To say, wait a minute, what you're going to end up doing is basically requiring other people to suffer horribly for your theology, right? So, that's a challenge. Right? You can imagine Soloveitchik saying back something like, oh, so I get it. The God that you believe in never tells you really to do anything other than your own ethical intuitions require also. So I think Heschel would say, you know what? Like, on some level, God asks me to radicalize my ethical intuitions. Right? I have a sense that it's forbidden for me to actively abuse someone. But what about actively soliciting her well-being? That's what, Judaism does. There's so much to say about this, and I can imagine Heschel saying, Akedah theology is basically, this is polemical and too simplistic, but let's count the number of prakim in Tanakh that are even about the Akedah. And then let's talk about, I don't know, all of Navi and most of Chumash. Is that about God wants you to sacrifice your ethical intuitions in the name of serving God? Really? Doesn't seem right to me at all. That seems preposterous and actually deeply morally and theologically disturbing. So your question is so powerful because I think it makes Heschel's point very powerfully. And that's a chasm, by the way, we'll get to this, between him on the one hand and Soloveitchik and Leibovich on the other. Put that in a different way. Think about it like this. For Heschel, ethics is part of self-transcendence. For Leibovich, at least, Soloveitchik is complicated. Ethics is on the human side of self-transcendence, right? To the extent that I do something because it's ethical, I'm doing it for human reasons. And I could imagine Heschel one by one tearing his hair out reading that. Really, Yeshayahu Leibovitz? Have you read Yeshayahu? Right? I mean, Shomu Shamayim, right? What are you talking about? Are you insane? You actually think that committing to the ethical is actually not religious? What canon are you reading? And we could go, and then you can imagine them going round and round and round and round. By the way, it's a fast. How many of you went to Orthodox day schools? So here, you tell me, impressionistically, I'm curious whether you think this is true. This was certainly my experience. Those later essays of Rabbi Soloveitchik, which are really interested in the Akedah, special issue of tradition, essay Catharsis, a whole bunch of essays of Rabbi Soloveitchik that really kind of get focused on the Akedah. have become so influential that if you learn Rabbi Soloveitchik in a yeshiva high school or in a yeshiva in Israel, you come to see everything he ever wrote filtered through those essays. Like when I used to teach halachic man every summer in this yeshiva, it was amazing. The kids who went to yeshiva day school would raise their hand and say, what about the Akedah? And I was like, what are you talking about? Isha halacha is all about the human agency. It is about everything that human beings tend to do. Human beings as creators of worlds. There's no surrender. There's nothing of that. That's all later. It's all later. Fascinatingly, most of it is after certain people in the RCA start talking about shifting halachic norms about women's status. Right? It is after Emmanuel Rackman wants to work on the Aguna question. And if you don't have any idea what I'm talking about, I'm happy to talk about it later. It's fascinating. And just so those of you who don't know me, the point is not to be reductive. It's not, their ideas are just contextual. But it is fascinating what situations make people think certain things. Right? What crises that people face. We talked about Heschel's crisis of modernity. His understanding of the crisis of modernity is what leads him not to talk in certain ways about, taking care of the self, balancing self and non-self. Soloveitchik's perception of the crisis of orthodoxy, as he perceives it, actually causes him to amp up this vision of halacha as deeply connected with an akedah. This is not a very tendentious reading of Rabbi Soloveitchik, but even Lawrence Kaplan, right, who is, I don't know what, Soloveitchik's translator, and fairly loyal to him in that way, basically says, he went to the RCA convention. He was very nervous because people were starting to talk about making shifts in halacha that he thought were problematic. And lo and behold, he starts talking about halachas and akedah, which totally makes sense, right? It cuts off ethical critique. It actually lives on in a certain way. It thrives on a certain chasm between my ethical perception and my sense of what the halakha requires. Does that make sense? Is that clear? This is not about, resolving that problem, which I'm happy to spend the rest of our lives trying to figure out. But it is really fascinating. If you want to speak philosophies, it's about Heschel refusing a theocentric, androcentric divide. Like, is it about God or is it about the well-being of others? Exactly, because God is obsessed with the well-being of others. That's the message of the Torah, he thinks. Is someone obligated to the widows and orphans because of God? I'll tell you what I think Heschel would say about this, and I want to say it without endorsing it, okay? I think he thinks, I'm pretty sure this is what he thinks, but, okay, that if you said to me, look, is it possible for individuals to have deeply ethical lives in which they authentically care about others, and those lives will be also totally godless? Yes, it is possible. If you ask me, is it possible for a culture to have no discourse of God and maintain its commitment to the well-being of others? I don't think so. Now, again, I don't want to endorse that position, but I do want to at least understand it, right? I think that's basically what he would say. He's not saying something crude like, if you're an atheist, you must be a behemoth, right? But I think he is saying something like, a culture that's atheistic is eventually going to be morally dangerous. Now, again, without being reductive, let's contextualize. Heschel is writing at a time when, what is the enemy of America as America describes it? Quote, godless communism. And what is the standard discourse about Nazism in that moment in time? That has changed a lot. It's a fundamentally secular revolt against religion. So the discourse of we need religion desperately to save us, religion is the only thing that can stop us from being barbarians, actually makes sense. One of the things I talk about very briefly in my book, I'm not the first person to say this, is, in a moment when America's enemy is radical Islam and not godless communism, some of this becomes complicated, right? What if the argument is that, what is the greatest goad to human cruelty in the world? Too much God, not too little. What about that? Which I think Heschel has an answer to, which is that's why I want to argue about who God is, right? I'm not saying God is a guarantee. Some people worship a God who sanctions their own cruelty. right? Some people write articles about how hatred is a virtue, right? Some people do that, right? And that's scary. But we could talk about this. Is it true? I'm going to say something totally like a marginal footnote to this, which I'm happy to talk about later, even though I'm totally tortured by this question, so I don't have any great wisdom about it. Every few years in the world of human rights theory, the following kind of debate flares up and collapses into people shouting at each other. Happened in the New York Times like a year or two ago. Somebody comes up and says, we've never really managed to come up with a workable theory of human dignity that does not depend on God. After which all of the secular moral philosophers start screaming Gewalt. What are you talking about? Human rights theory is inherently secular because it's universal. Which, strange, right? There's a lot of philosophical assumptions there, right? But Michael Perry, American moral philosopher, basically says, yeah, let's be honest, dignity, the whole discourse of dignity lives on borrowed time from theology. Where else are you going to ground dignity from? Certainly if you want a metaphysical notion of dignity, where does it come from? Now, that is a debate I wouldn't have the first clue how to resolve. But you could say that that is a sort of more philosophically sophisticated version of this very argument. You follow what I'm saying? Right? That is to say, like, how much do certain commitments require some kind of theological frame? Of course, you could come back and say, yes, but the fascination with murdering everyone I hate can also be bolstered by God. Which Heschel would say, in good Gemara way, in achinami. Yes, that's also true. That's why, once again, I want to argue for what kind of God we should worship. I want to take 2 steps forward, and then we're going to look at some sources on tefillah together. Okay? There's something that's just worth saying because I think it's interesting and challenging for many of us. Heschel argues, I think this is what he's arguing, this is more some of my trying to draw him out, that there's a paradox that we all face, is that we seek in modernity what we call self-expression, and yet he thinks that authentic self-expression is actually found in giving. The selves that we really are ultimately, that we are and that we are intended to be, are generous. And the more we assert ourselves as a way of expressing ourselves, the less, let's put it differently, the farther we end up from authentic self-expression. Did that sentence make any sense to you? No? Okay. So we're all looking for ways to express ourselves, and we do that often by asserting ourselves. And Heschel argues that actually authentic self-expression is in giving. So the more we assert ourselves as an attempt to express ourselves, the farther away we get from the very thing in theory we're searching for, which is the expression of our true selves. The expression of our true selves is in response. Ma Hashem Elohecha sho'el mi'imach. Yes, that is the truest self. Now, some of you who study evolutionary psychology could go bananas at that sentence, right? Actually, the authentic self is complicated, right? And I don't know whether this is a rhetorical statement or a philosophically defensible one, but I think it's actually a very powerful idea. The more we assert ourselves, the farther away we end up from true self-expression. Okay, now, look at source 6 for a minute. I'm sorry, source 4, okay? Religion is not expediency. Of all the things we do, prayer is the least expedient, the least worldly, the least practical. Can I just ask you for a minute, does that sentence strike you as, oh yes, of course that's true, or that's kind of true, or what's he talking about? Those are your 3 choices. Not that I'm scripting you, but I'm just curious. Like, what do you hear that sentence? What do you think about that? Prayer is prayer is the least expedient thing we do. Okay, so the comment is, disciplining yourself has a practical dimension. I think by practical he means something. I want to maybe nuance, because what you said is really interesting. He's talking about, what if he said it this way? Prayer is the least self-serving thing we do. I think that's what he means, right? It's the least self-serving thing we do. Again, this is not an empirical sociology. He is not kind of walking through a contemporary synagogue, denomination doesn't matter, right? And saying like, oh, I've now analyzed the consciousness of the people at prayer, and let me tell you, There's no ego in this room. He's not saying that. And it may have practical benefits in the positive sense of it actually allows. I think he would want prayer to be practical in the sense of when I leave tefillah, this is something Mordechai Kaplan used to say, right? If you're the same person when you leave shul as when you came in, why did you go? Now, Leibovitch would find that obscene. Why did I go? Because I'm chayav. No, really. I mean, that's its own thing, right? But Kaplan would say, presuming you think religion has some aspiration to shape you as a person, presuming you think that, it has some practical benefit. Heschel would say, yes, look, if I am more attentive to your pain after I pray, that's a practical benefit, but that's a practical benefit in the good sense. I think practical, again, here is about like selfish, serving me. Being more confident. You know what it's like? You ever read any of Frederick Douglass's autobiographies? So in the narrative of the life of a slave by Frederick Douglass, he talks about, I'm sure there are many other slave narratives that talk about similar things, but it is such a terrifying, I don't know what the word is, horrific thing to read. When Douglass talks about, I hope I'm remembering this right, it's been like 25 years, where he says, you know, the day that all the slaves were most afraid of when I was a boy were Sundays. Because the master would come home from church totally convinced that he was in good with God, and then he would beat the daylights out of us because he had no fear. Right? That's the sort of like ad absurdum case of like religion as self-serving. But like if the master came home and said, you know, I have to liberate my slaves because I see their full dignity, that would be a practical end that Heschel would value. You know, so I think we'd have to tease apart what we mean by practical. And even the discipline question that two of you have mentioned is interesting. Like discipline, you know, that shapes me as a kind of person who's able to live from a place of inner freedom as opposed to just doing whatever impulse declares, right? That may also be a form of self-transcendence or self-discovery if it's talking about the authentic self. I'm going to sum up what you just said in one shallow, superficial sentence, but I think it captures something important, and it's the level that I operate on. Love, genuine love, is the opposite of expediency. Genuine love is all about the reality of the person in front of me, or the reality of the God that I worship. So mitzvot as trainings in the art of love, yes, on one level, learning love is very practical. It's even a discipline of a certain kind. But it is not part of the egocentric predicament. Because authentic love is, at least in part, about you. Right? This, I think, is also really central to Buber. What I'm about to say is not completely true, but it's partially true, and I think it's a helpful way of thinking about I and thou. Buber distinguishes between the word experience and the word encounter. Experience for Buber is a very bad word. And encounter is like the sacred project of human life. What's the difference? When I encounter someone, there's me and there's you. When I experience someone, there's me and there's a way you make me feel. But you are not there. That's kind of what you're saying. Love, I think, right, makes space for a consciousness that is not mine. Doesn't swallow it, doesn't abuse it, doesn't manipulate it, actually lets it be. This is what Buber calls the between, right? Das Zwischen. Right? The reality that there's me and there's you, and you're real. If prayer does that, that's a kind of practicality that should be regarded as the most sacred thing in the world. There are things to say about how Buber and Heschel are not the same about tefillah, but for this purpose, it's fine. Maybe we could say one last thing to help us struggle with that. The temptation to say something like, well, if what prayer really is just an attempt to meet my real needs, which when I'm struggling to figure out a way to say this, but self-transcendence is not just another way of serving myself, right? You have to have the good faith assumption that it can be genuinely about God or others. And the moment it can genuinely be about that, then it's not the same as any other form of self-expression. It's something else. it's only a certain kind of, I'm not accusing you of this, I think I'm accusing all of us in this way, a certain kind of cynicism that says, well, it's just another way of doing what I need. I thought what I needed was to acquire more things, but what I really needed was to love you, but it was always only about me. I think Heschel thinks we can do a little bit less cynical than that. It says that I might be losing you here, but let's leave this for a minute, okay? So what are we doing when we pray? I want to just ask you, we're not going to do this out loud, but I want to ask you to be thinking about the following question. How is what you did the last time you davened mincha related to the notion of overcoming egocentrism? Or is it? Right? Because that's the question, right? Unless it's this sort of poreach ba'avir, right, like floating in the air, how is it connected to the reality of Jewish prayer? Okay? So look at source 6, because I think this is actually, in some ways, the key paragraph to understand some of what he's trying to say, and whether it's persuasive or not, we can talk about. We do not step out of the world when we pray. We merely see the world in a different setting. The self is not the hub, but the spoke of the revolving wheel. The self is not the hub, but the spoke of the revolving wheel. In prayer, we shift the center of living from self-consciousness to self-surrender. God is the center to which all forces tend. God is the source, and we are the flowing of his force, the ebb and flow of his tides. Prayer takes the mind out of the narrowness of self-interest and enables us to see the world in the mirror of the holy. For when we betake ourselves to the extreme opposite of the ego, we can behold a situation from the aspect of God, at the vantage point of God. The sentence, the self is not the hub, but the spoke of the revolving wheel. We can maybe introduce another term to the set of terms here, decentering the self, realizing that my ego is not the center of the universe. Now, on one level, all of us would say, well, pshita, ma'u detema, what are you talking about? Of course I know my ego is not the center of the world. And yet, all of us every day spend most of our days functioning as if our ego is the center of the universe. After all, we experience the universe through our own head. And I mean that very seriously. And I actually think that almost all religious traditions, in different ways, I'm a big believer in not facilely saying that all religions do the same thing, but all religious traditions on some level are committed to helping us see that as an illusion, right? The fact that I perceive the world through my own consciousness no more makes my consciousness the center of the universe than the fact that you perceive it through yours, right? It's not true. And what prayer in particular and spiritual life in general, according to Heschel and many other people, does is remind me that despite the illusory nature of my own perception, something else is the center of the world. And for Heschel, that's God. By the way, fascinatingly, this is just a throwaway comment for another day. The image of the spoke and the hub appears in only one other place in Heschel, when he talks about how religions should view each other. Right? And then if you like this kind of Heschel Soloveitchik stuff, Heschel says, there was a time when you could not convince a man in Boston that Boston was not the center of the universe. Right? No Religion is an Island is written a few weeks after confrontation. Right? It's right? Very gently. But something about how do we move ourselves from the illusion that the way we perceive the world is the truth of the universe. The way we experience the world is the truth of the universe. Okay? That's the argument. Now, just how does that happen? If there were only 10 of us in the room and we were not on video, I would ask the following question. How does the Amida, or does the Amida, do that? Has it ever done that for you? Does it do that all the time? By the way, has it ever done that for you is a horribly expedient sounding formulation, right? It's very hard to escape this way of talking. Has it ever generated a moment where you forgot about yourself? And then there's a question that probably pops up. Really? During bakashot? During petitions, when I'm asking for things that in theory I need? That's how I forget myself and realize, how does that work? This is why Soloveitchik, fascinating, will say, that's just not what self-transcendence is. So look now, this is amazing. Look at source 7. And this is Lou's question that we're going to try to analyze. Source 7 says the following, okay? And this is, we're going to see what you make of this, okay? The focus of prayer is not the self. Prayer comes to pass. Now, already now we should realize prayer and davening is not the same thing. Meaning, how do I say this? Not every moment when I'm davening is a moment when I'm praying. I once had this experience in college. It was like one of the most humiliating moments of my life. Ira Eisenstein, Mordechai Kaplan's son-in-law and a very prominent constructionist rabbi, came to Harvard Hill. He was like 80, late 80s or something, and he gave some talk, and I had just come back from yeshiva, which basically means I was like, you probably heard me say, I was the smuggest person in the universe, right? It's like I was like, whatever. So he says to the group, he says, so how often do you pray? So in my I say 3 times a day. He says, young man, I didn't ask you how frequently you davened. And like a week later, when they dug me out of the floorboards, right? It was like totally, it was like so, but it was such a great, and it's not often you can say that Heschel and Kaplan are saying the same thing theologically, but here, this thing about the focus of the prayer is not the self. Prayer comes to pass in a complete turning of the heart towards God, towards God's goodness and power. It is the momentary, by the way, for what I said earlier, notice the use of the adjective momentary. It is the momentary disregard of our personal concerns, the absence of self-centered thoughts, which constitute the art of prayer. Feeling becomes prayer in the moment in which we forget ourselves and become aware of God. Now, here's the question that clearly pops up in Heschel's mind as he says this. But I'm asking God for things. When we analyze the consciousness of a supplicant, we discover that it is not concentrated upon his own interests, but on something beyond the self. The thought of personal need is absent, and the thought of divine grace alone is present in his mind. Thus, in beseeching God for bread, there is one instant at least in which our mind is directed neither to our hunger nor to food, but to God's mercy. That instant is prayer. What did he just do? I want you for a minute to do exactly what he wouldn't want you to do. Just analyze for me philosophically what he just did. And then we'll talk about the spiritual claim that he just made. What did he just do? What was the move he made? How do you understand what just happened in this paragraph? Let's take a very concrete example. I'm saying rifa'inu, right? And what I'm accustomed to think, and I'm going to say this one because it's actually in some ways the hardest one for us to let go of, and maybe we don't want to. So I'm choosing this one. Might be easier for some of us if I say like Tzakav Shofar Gadol Cherutenu or something, right? Which some of us have trouble connecting to. I'm tempted to make jokes about sacrifices in the Third Temple, but it seems too much in Yana Dioma. So I say Rifa'enu, and I know it seems like what I'm really focused on is my own need for healing, me or someone I care about. But Heschel says, no, when prayer happens? When I say, Baruch Atah Hashem, Rofei Cholei Amo Yisrael. When petition actually emerges as a kind of moment of praise. It becomes about what God is and not what I'm asking for. To go back to Lou's question, I'll say this in philosophies and then like a normal person, right? What Heschel does, because he's struggling with the Amida, is to say, we should not look at the words, we should look at the phenomenology of the person who's praying. Because what you realize is that in an authentic moment of prayer, by the way, to be fair, he's defining it, right? But in an authentic moment of prayer, I forget about what I'm asking for. And I actually am focused totally on God. It's almost like petition really becomes another form of praise. Now, I can't allow myself to do what I'm tempted to do, which is to say, how many people know what he's talking about? No, and I don't mean, this is what the Amida is, but have had moments where, yeah, totally, I get that, where it's actually, everything becomes about praise. And it's not about asking for things. Now, again, Rifa'inu, consciously by choice, is probably the hardest one. But think about other ones. Because he's saying something here that's actually, I think, potentially very powerful. And maybe we could say it like this. It is clear to me that if Heschel were a member of Chazal, right? He's like living at 400. He's like, this is not really what Chazal's life was. He's hanging out reciting Memras. He's like saying stuff, right? Heschel's a member of Chazal. It's clear to me that he would have fought very hard for the word tefillah in rabbinic Hebrew to mean, actually you probably have to go earlier than that, but for the word tefillah to refer to Pesukei Zimra and not the Amidah. What do I mean by that, right? Because praise is in a more obvious way not about me. Petition for this notion of self-transcendence is more complicated. After all, I'm asking for stuff. And petition bothers him or strikes him as, maybe I should have better than that. It's not that it bothers him. It strikes him as definitely not the highest form of prayer a human being can achieve. And I would ask you, by the way, if you've never done this, give yourself a homework assignment and spend a few minutes now, 6 months from now, and 12 months from now, a few minutes each time, asking yourself, what is the highest form of prayer? What am I doing in the highest ideal of prayer as I understand it? Am I asking for things? Am I praising? Am I saying thank you? Am I saying sorry? There are ways you can construct all of those as about overcoming the ego. But for Heschel, I think it's very clear that it's about praise, so much so that even petition becomes praise. Now, you could argue, no, that's what really goes on in the Amidah. Or you can say, he's doing violence to the Amidah. Okay, you know what? I think, in the interest of time, that we should try and hold what Heschel said and what Mary Brett said as an illustration of it for a second in mind as we think about a different model of what it means to overcome the ego in prayer. And I want to try to think about this together for a minute. So skip to source 11, because I want to make sure we give some time. Okay? So now here, let me just say one methodological thing. It is not always clear whether, let alone how, all of Rabbi Soloveitchik's essays can be integrated with one another. Right? That is to say, unlike Heschel, for whom there is very much like an almost seamless, right? There's one conversation. There's a big debate among scholars of Rabbi Soloveitchik about whether the essays are meant to be all integratable with one another. I many years ago, people always think I'm joking, but I'm not. I many years ago started to work on something called Is Halachic Man Lonely? Because I was trying to figure out, do these books, are they supposed to map onto each other, or are they just sort of snapshots of, here's what I'm thinking right now? It's a very hard question in Soloveitchik, because at very least, on the surface, it's hard to know how to integrate them, some of them, okay? So that said, I am picking up on one particular strand in some of Rabbi Soloveitchik's essays on tefillah that I think form an interesting contrast. This is like heuristic. It's not he didn't write these in response to Heschel. I just think it's a different way of thinking about it, and I'm hoping it'll give you more material to play with as you think about this, okay? So from an essay called The Crisis of Human Finitude, number 11. Prayer as a personal experience, as a creative gesture, is possible only if and when man discovers himself in crisis or in need. That is why the Jewish idea of prayer differs from the mystical idea, insofar as we have emphasized the centrality of the petition, while the mystics have stressed the relevance of the hymn. Since prayer flows from a personality which finds itself in need, despondent, and hopeless, its main theme is not praise or adoration, but rather request, demand, supplication. Doesn't get any different on some level, right? Now, I want to read one more paragraph from Prayer as Dialogue, which is not exactly an essay by Soloveitchik. It's, people don't usually use these books anymore. These are notes. One of Heschel's students, Rabbi Abraham Bestin, took notes in shiurim and then published them with Soloveitchik's approval. Okay. The principal topic of Jewish prayer is techina, petition or supplication. Praise and thanksgiving are merely prologues and epilogues. Kind of what you learned in 6th grade, right? First I actually remember my teacher saying, first we butter got up, then we ask for what we want, and then we say thank you and bow, right? So praise and thanksgiving are merely prologues and epilogues. Most of the Psalms are petitionary. Isaac prayed for progeny. Christians and mystics consider techina an unworthy form of prayer, a cash and carry relationship, a form of trade or barter, a sacrifice for a recompense, a self-directed prayer. This focus on supplication is based on our singling out of one particular emotion above all others as the central requisite for prayer, namely dependence and helplessness. Though contradictory emotions may exist, such as joy, sadness, gratitude, submission, shyness, the feeling of dependence in our state of wretchedness is paramount. That is, for those of you who are students of Rabbi Soloveitchik, classic Soloveitchik talk. It's like very existentialism inflected. We find ourselves in the world lost, right? Classic, we are thrown. And prayer happens when I can acknowledge that I'm broken, dependent, helpless, maybe even hopeless. That's prayer. How many people have ever had the experience that this is what prayer is and that that's self-transcendent? Those are two questions. Okay, so you're saying that both in the liturgy and in personal experience, that's much easier to relate to than Heschel's rather sort of elevated and also to you abstract sounding description of what prayer really is.
Yeah, I don't know if I fully understand what Heschel's really getting at yet.
So,
I'm not sure if I can evaluate it.
So it's interesting because think about this model of self-transcendence, which again, this is, in this context, it's my importation of the term, but is about the realization that I am fundamentally needy and not autonomous, vulnerable, dependent. By the way, another central project of Sefer Dvarim, right? Acknowledging, I can't do this all myself. The opposite of kochi va'otzem yadi asali et hachayil hazeh, right? I did it all myself. No, it's not true. When I'm sick, I can't make myself better. Or, in some ways, worse, when the person I love most in the world, my child, my spouse, my whatever, whoever, right? God, I cannot do this. I sort of imagine Soloveitchik saying, that is self-transcendence. That is giving up the illusion that we are God. Neediness does that. To which, just one second, to which I think Heschel's response is, and this is maybe where it's both compelling and troubling for many of us, I want to be more ambitious than that. Because the fact is, knowing that I am not autonomous is still thinking about I. And I want to talk about self-transcendence where I think about you. You, in that sentence, I mean with a capital Y, right? Talk about you. That was something I came to realize. I have no idea if this is apologetic or pshat. I'm genuinely not sure. But after years of finding like Rosh Hashanah davening just so weird, like wondering about like how vain is the Kadosh Baruch Hu, right? Rosh Hashanah, it's like you don't even do tshuva. You just basically stand there saying, you know, God, you're this, you're that. It's great, right? And then I realized actually maybe what the liturgy is about is training us to say you. Because they think that that's somehow integral to the process of tshuva. And we find it very hard, because I want to talk about myself. You remember what, none of you are old enough to remember what the late Mayor Ed Koch used to say? He would do these interviews, right? He would do these interviews, and then he would say, but enough about me, let's talk about you. How do you think I'm doing? He used to say it all the time. And I think he knew he was out of control, but like, saying something outright. I think Heschel is sort of saying, I cannot believe I just used that as an illustration of anything related to prayer, but I think Heschel is actually trying to say something. And here's a kind of like, almost you could say a different spiritual intuition. It's not a machloket you can resolve, right? Heschel's saying, no, like the goal of prayer is to make me forget about myself. And Soloveitchik is saying, no, first of all, I don't know what that means, right? And second of all, that's not the goal of prayer. The goal of prayer is to give up the illusion that I am God. That's self-transcendence. To which Heschel would say, really? It still sounds like it's about the self. And then we can go, you can start spinning the circle back and forth, arguing about it. But it's like that's a little bit of what's at stake in this battle. I could imagine one arguing that Heschel might say to Soloveitchik, in this day and age, the most urgent thing in the world is not the realization that I'm needy. It's actually the realization that other people are needy. And the way to do that is to remember that I am not the center of the world. To which one could imagine Soloveitchik saying, right, just play this out. Well, actually, one of the best ways to achieve empathy is to realize that I'm needy also. So don't assume so quickly that your picture leads to caring about others, right? I mean, something that I've spoken about a lot over the last year in different places, right? That actually what compassion requires a willingness to struggle with my own vulnerability. Otherwise, all I'm capable of is pity and not compassion, right? Pity is the illusion that, yeah, you're down there, sucks for you, forgive my language, right? I would never have that experience. I would never have that experience. After all, I'm me. I'm rich, I'm powerful, I'm healthy, whatever I am, right? Compassion basically says, right, with all of the vulnerability that we both share by dint of being human and embodied, right, I reach across to you. So you could imagine Soloveitchik saying, I don't know that you're so sure that your path leads to a greater ethical sensitivity. Maybe actually mine does. Elsewhere, by the way, because something that you mentioned before, elsewhere Soloveitchik says something totally beautiful, a totally different vision of, well, I don't know, totally different, but a different way of talking about prayer. He says that the most amazing thing in his mind about the book of Eov is that when Eov prays for himself, God basically ignores him. And only when Eov starts praying for his friends does God say, okay, let's talk. Because Eov has learned that he has to truly want other people to have what they need too. I have sometimes done in minyanim that I've been the rabbi of, I'm still not sure this is actually a productive thing to do, but I find it helpful to, as people feel often disconnected or alienated from davening, I suggested to people on Yom Kippur that they spend at least part of the tefillah thinking about something that they really need and praying that someone else they know gets it and maybe even gets it first. As an experiment in what it means to sort of not have my ego be the center of the universe. Was it Gore Vidal who had that great line? Every time a friend of mine succeeds, a little part of me dies inside. Right? Tells you a lot about Gore Vidal, right? Disgusting, right? But it's what I'm trying to do is figure out, is there a way we can use prayer to do the opposite? To sort of say, I want you to have it. And then, in Soloveitchik's understanding, God says, okay, let's talk. You prayed for another person. I think that's one of the ways. I mean, none of the people we're talking about says this. I think that might be one of the reasons we actually daven tchinot in the plural. Is that it's a compromise in a way. I don't know if compromise is the right word, but yes, I'm praying for what I need, but not just for me to get it. Right? And that's a whole nother form. It acknowledges that need is not something that I seek to transcend. Petition is not something that I seek to transcend, but I do seek to expand my circle of concern even as I'm asking. Rifa'enu, even the people I don't know. Maybe even the person in this room I don't like that much. That's a good, by the way, experiment sometime. Pray for someone you don't intuitively like that much to get something they really want. That's a spiritual practice, by the way. It's much less easy than you think, especially if you're a Benoni like me. It's hard. It's hard. I know this guy sitting here thinking he thinks he's a Benoni. Look who thinks he's a Benoni. You think he's a Russia. But okay. Okay. So let's play with that. And I'm going to actually ask you, I mean, do with this as you will. The next time you daven the Amida, this is a good way to end up doing neither, but play with these two models of what they're each saying, right? Heschel's model of essentially saying, no, what I'm really trying to do in those bakashot is actually, on some level, transform them into praise. And Soloveitchik saying, no, I'm acknowledging that in the end of the day, I can't do it myself. Okay? Since we're going to run out of time, I'm going to just forward for a minute. This has nothing to do with Jewish sources, but Jean-Louis Chrétien, who is a continental philosopher, which means he's very hard to understand, says the following interesting thing about tefillot of bakasha. He's also not a Jew. To ask, right? To ask is to actually acknowledge not being the origin of every good and every gift. All prayer confesses God by dispossessing us of our egocentrism. I brought this only because this is a case where you have a Christian thinker who basically says, I'm going to say what Soloveitchik says, but I'm going to tell you that is what self-transcendence is. Right? Because Soloveitchik doesn't explicitly say that here, but Chrétien says exactly that. Now, Leibovitch is going to give us a third model, okay, which, yeah, I don't want to editorialize about it, but I want, okay, the sole meaning of prayer as a religious institution, underline this, the sole meaning of prayer as a religious institution is the service of God by the man who accepts the yoke of the kingdom of heaven. His acceptance becomes real through his assumption of the burden of Torah and mitzvot. Only the prayer which one prays as the observance of a mitzvah is religiously significant. Amazingly, in this essay, Leibovitch says, quoting Sefer Tehillim, Tfilah la'ani ki ya'atof, right, a prayer of a needy person. He says, this is very interesting, but it has no religious value whatsoever. Right? This is what you might call a, Isaiah Berlin's famous distinction between foxes and hedgehogs, right? People familiar with that distinction, right? A fox knows many things, a hedgehog knows one. Leibovitch is the quintessential Jewish hedgehog. He has one idea. I'm not saying that dismissively. I actually think there's something very moving about having one idea. The one idea is, it is about obeying the will of God. By the way, it is not about the obeying the will of God. It is about the free decision to obey the will of God. It is more philosophically interesting than it is usually made out to be. I would say it is not that much more philosophically interesting than it made out to be, but it is a little bit more philosophically interesting, meaning he's saying something other than, oh, what do? I just obey. He's saying something I think actually kind of interesting, that he thinks is a theological version of Kant. It is that the decision to obey God's will and only God's will. But I do that freely. If I don't do it freely, if I don't have a sense of my own freedom, I haven't done it. That is actually more interesting than the caricature of him. Okay? But it leads him to have to say crazy things like much of Sefer Tehillim is not religiously valuable. Right? Only the prayer which one prays as the observance of a mitzvah is religiously significant. So the spontaneous prayer a man prays of his own accord is, of course, halachically permissible. But like the performance of any act which has not been prescribed, its religious value is limited. I think that that's actually not consistent. I think he would say his religious value is virtually non-existent. As a religious act, it is even faulty, since he who prays to satisfy his needs sets himself up as an end, as though God were a means for promotion of his welfare. As in the case of any mitzvah, prayer is no different than any mitzvah. I do it because it's a mitzvah. I could be putting on my tzitzis or praying. It is the same act of deciding to obey God's will. As in the case of any mitzvah, prayer, especially prayer, is religiously significant only if it is performed because it is a mitzvah. Its religious value is minimal when it is performed out of free inclination. And then just a couple more sentences. The grandeur and power of prayer, prayer that is mandatory and fixed by halakha, lie precisely in setting aside all of man's interests and motives out of awareness of man's position before God, a position which is always the same regardless of any personal circumstance. And then his favorite example, so Leibovitch loves this image, that you have to say the same Amida as you're about to get married and when you've just buried your spouse, which tells you it's not about you or the state you're in. What it's about is the free decision to obey Ritzon Hashem as mediated by halacha. Now, as in the case of Soloveitchik, I'm not doing this justice in the sense that we're not kind of analyzing how this is of a piece with the whole religious world. But Leibovitch is essentially saying, no, you know what self-transcendence is? It's something totally different than either Heschel or Soloveitchik. Self-transcendence is choosing to do the will of a will other than my own. And thus, reminding myself that I am really not the center of the universe. After all, the highest place I can get to is not doing what I want, but only what God wants. The reason I keep hedging in my sentence is because saying that God wants for Leibovitch is very problematic, but doing what halakha has constructed as a way of obeying the will of God. That doesn't help, it's not any better, but okay. I want to say a strange thing that maybe is helpful. You know, some of us convince ourselves very often that we value consistency tremendously, which I am actually very skeptical of most of the time. Because I think some of the people we most demonize are actually the people who are most consistent. Right? The most consistent thinker in all of 20th century Jewish theology was the Satmar Rebbe. Right? Satmar Rebbe basically spent his whole life saying that the Aguda was a disgrace. Why? Because they say they're not Zionists. And look at them, right? Look at them licking their Israeli postage stamps. Right? Just living off this thing that they're supposed to dislike. No. I want no part, and I mean no part of this. Now, lahavdil, these are very different conceptions of what one idea is. But, Leibovich is basically utterly consistent. And it is about actually, no, I do only one thing. The only thing that matters to a Jew is the decision to obey the will of God. And it's not about my deciding the nature of that God. I know Heschel loves the loosey-goosey God who loves widows and orphans, but come on, grow up. Haven't you read the Rambam? No, I'm saying that offensively because it's intended to be offensive. And if you've ever read anything by or about Leibovich, you know he loved. Leibovich was not gentle. Right? Really? Oh, isn't that sweet? God loves you. Huh. Nice. Discovered that in my chemistry lab also. And what are you talking about? You sound like a lunatic. No. All there is, by the way, it's amazing how secular Leibovich is in a certain way, right? The world works totally without any intrusion of God in any way. The world is on some level empty of God. All there is a transcendent creator. There is no divine immanence of any kind. God is not in the world in any way. There's a transcendent God whom I worship by obeying the best Jewish approximation of his will. And Vincent's critique is actually very powerful, which is, yeah, well, if all it is a will, it's totally random. To which I think Leibovich might say, yes, if by random you mean not accessible to your own wisdom. This is where, for those of you who find this kind of stuff interesting, Leibovich is an anti-Maimonidean. Because for the Rambam, what it means to worship God is to know that everything we do has wisdom in it. Ki hi chochmatchem uvinatchem leinei ha'amim. Deuteronomy 4:6, mashu kazeh, right? Rambam thinks it all has to make sense, otherwise it's a sacrilege. What? You worship a capricious God who just tells you what he wants? Leibovich thinks, yeah, that's how it becomes not about me. Well, it's funny. Avi Sagi has this really interesting essay where he says, the problem with Leibovich's insistence, Avi Sagi, a contemporary Israeli philosopher, he says that the problem with a philosophy like Leibovich's is when you accuse everyone else of doing things for their own purposes, ultimately you get hoist by your own petard. Because maybe you, Leibovich, desperately need to convince yourself that all you're doing is obeying a will other than your own. You can't do that. When you start waving that dagger around at everyone, it ultimately cuts you too. Right? You just happen to have a different set of idiosyncratic needs. You need to convince yourself that it's not about you in any way. Look, more dramatically, it seems like a very odd thing to say, right? In other words, if you were to read Tanakh and Chazal, you would probably not come away with the impression that God doesn't have purposes in mind in the mitzvot. Should I say that more clearly? God doesn't have a purpose. You would come to the conclusion that God has purposes beyond your obedience. By the way, the words that appear again and again in Dvarim, letovlach. Those are very important words for Sefer Dvarim. I give you the mitzvot because they, on some level, are for your own good. They actually foment human well-being. And Leibovich, in one of his inimitably sort of brutal phrases, says, yes, every time you tell me that a ritual has some value on a human level, that is not religion, it is avodah sozialit. Right? It's social work. which made people crazy. I mean, you're basically saying that like everything that like the Rambam says in the Moreh Nevuchim is avodah sozialit, right? But here's where this might be useful. I think, because this is pathetic. So I have done on a couple of occasions something very counterintuitive. When I have taught groups of Reform rabbis, I read Leibovitch with them. And the reason is because I think it is, with all its limits and even like on some level like, extremeness, it is trying very hard, again, in an over-the-top extreme way, to articulate what would it look like if religion really weren't about me? What if it were really, really not about me? Oh, you don't find it meaningful? Wonderful, you have a chance to be Mekayim Mitzvah for the first time. No, it's counterintuitive, and some of you might even find it religiously offensive, but it's not uninteresting, right? You don't find it you only daven when you find it meaningful. Aha. So religion is not about you? How? If you don't do it when you don't want to do it, and sometimes because you don't want to do it, maybe, right? You've never really tasted what self-transcendence is like. Aseh retzoncha. Aseh retzoncha retzono, right? Transform your will so that what you want to do is what God does. That's not English. Well, right? What God wants you to do. This is a third possibility. Again, I don't know if there are any genuine Leibovitchians in the world. I'm not sure one could be one. Unless one was really willing to say that every time, ritual also led to human ends. Oh yeah, social work. You could imagine both Heschel and Soloveitchik basically like screaming their heads off, saying, what are you talking about? It isn't a tremendous amount of Torah about creating love between people and actually helping people heal from being sick? I just don't know what you're talking about. This just seems like taking an idea and going nuts. And again, you can imagine that there is a kind of response to what, maybe this is obvious, but maybe it's also worth saying. Anytime you read a thinker, it's worth thinking about what is the crisis or the failing, either in religious life or in human life more broadly, that he thinks he's addressing. Right? We talked about this in the case of Heschel at great length. In the case of Soloveitchik, one of the things you could say is the illusion of modern men and women that oh yeah, we're gods. And in the case of Leibovitch, it's interesting to speculate on what he's arguing against. There's probably a lot of answers to that question, but as opposed to caricaturing him, it's worth thinking what is he trying to undo? Because I'm fairly confident no one in this Beit Midrash is going to end up a convinced Leibovitchian, but is there something that he's saying that's actually valuable in the process of learning to decenter our egos in some ways? The statement or the proposition that prayer is not just about discovering that we're not God, but also creating the possibility of relationship. I think that in different modes, both Rabbis Heschel and Soloveitchik would say, yeah, but in order to really have a relationship, you have to really internalize that you're not God. Meaning, I think Heschel would say, yeah, well, what makes it possible to respond to God? What makes it possible to love God is on some level realizing that, you didn't create the world. That's what wonder is, right? And so I'm not sure there's a contradiction there ultimately for them. For Leibovitch, you're just speaking gibberish, right? In the sense that, you think you love God? That sounds just creepy. No, right, in other words, loving God is about deciding to obey God's will. I don't think it's very hard to imagine the kind of textured relationship that you're talking about with a God who is totally transcendent and not immanent in any way. Footnote to that, the Rambam thinks he's done just that. So I'm not dismissing that. I'm just saying it's hard to imagine exactly what that looks like, right? But Heschel and Soloveitchik's God they both believe in a deeply relational God. But they think, it's hard to have a relationship. If the only word you're capable of saying is I, it's hard to be in a relationship. Try dating someone like that. Try going through a phase where you are that person. and ask someone else to live with you. Right? No, right? Because I think there very much is, and it's a very helpful image that you're talking about here. The translation from, what a certain openness to relationality looks like in the human domain, and what an openness to relationality looks like in the other domain, in the theological domain. That sounded obscure. And yet, Leibovitch, in a very interesting way, is basically saying, all that sounds like crazy talk to me. That's not what religion is. You can have your metaphor as God as lover, and you might want to grow up. I'm not saying that to you. I'm saying that's a little bit what Leibovitch is saying. That's what makes him appealing to certain people, and just sort of bizarre and having thrown out the house for many, maybe most, other religious people. I suspect, by the way, that there's also one of the things that Leibovitch is also arguing against, and this will be my second to last sentence, is the context of what he saw as a religious Zionism losing its mind and being totally confident that it knew what God wanted about every last detail of every last political decision, and in fact that God wanted some specific thing about this particular detail, and basically saying, okay, I'm done with this. This is not what religion is about at all. Right? As he says in his classical, obnoxious, totally creative way, Elohim hu lo ha-manager shel ha-historia. Right? God is not the manager of history. That is like a direct frontal assault on Tzvi Yehuda Kook and everyone. It's a frontal assault. You people are nuts. That's his position on all that. So again, context does matter, right? Heschel is in the context of godless communism in America, right, in those words. Soloveitchik, Leibovitch is with something else. And Soloveitchik, we saw at least to some degree, is about a fear, about a too liberal conception of halakha. Okay. The last sentence I want to say is, the last two sources, just so you can see them, have another dimension of Heschel's vision of tefillah that I think is connected, and I just want to have you think about. And that is the notion that what tefillah is about is making a space in the world for God, in a world from which God has been exiled. And when I first started working on Heschel in a serious way, I always found it interesting. How do these two motifs combine? Self-transcendence on the one hand, and creating a space for God on the other. And then I realized that I think what he's saying is actually extremely beautiful, although he never actually says it, right? But I think what he's groping towards is the idea that what keeps God out of the world? Self-assertion, ego, the will to power, the desire to dominate others, the desire to impose my will on others. So in overcoming the ego, in recognizing that I am not the center of the universe, in recognizing that other realities make a claim on me, I in fact make space. Self-transcendence is a form of tzimtzum. It is a form of making space for realities other than me, and thereby opening a space for God to return to the world. And it's a very moving image, apropos of Joey being here. He talks about, who you'll meet, he talks about, what is the job of a cantor, right? Job of a cantor is to pull God's presence down from heaven into the world through egolessness. Right? It's in its own quiet way scathing. Right? But it's about that's what does a person who reads prayer does? Create an opening where it's no longer about me all the time. It's no longer about us. There's room for other realities, God and other people, or God and the widows and orphans whom God tells me to love. So actually, self-transcendence, I don't know why he never quotes this. There's a Gemara that says, I forget now where it is, that God says about the person who is a Ba'al Ga'ava, something like, the person who's arrogant, something like, Ein ani v'hu darim b'chvifa achat. An egotist and I can't dwell in the same space. I think that's what Heschel intuitively is after. So self-transcendence is about opening up a space in the world for that which is not us, which is other people and God. Shkoach, thank you.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the non-profit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jem, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.